pets, like
Yes.
squirrels in armor and things
Guinea
like
pigs
that.
in armor. Yep.
Oh, guinea pigs.
You've never seen it. It was for sale on eBay for $25,000 about 6 years ago.
Ouch.
Armor for a guinea pig.
Okay.
I mean, if you want to have your guinea pig battle ready, it's worth every penny, but yeah.
I will start us on YouTube. I'm sending the link on chat. Feel free to share as you see fit. And I'll also hit recording, and then I'll introduce you, Elizabeth, and then you take it from there.
We'll introduce all of our lovely guests.
Okay, recording form. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first guest roundtable, which is medievalism and gaming. And this will be chaired by Elizabeth Book from the, just a second, because I need to check my notes on the university, which is the Palacky University in the Czech Republic. Elizabeth?
Great, so I'm going to take it over from here. Just a heads up to our lovely audience who are in the Zoom with us. You are trapped in here with us, not us with you. So if you have any questions for the panel, we will be taking questions, but if you could please put them in the chat. I'll be collecting them. If for some reason I don't grab your question, please repost it in the chat, and I promise I will acknowledge it and collect it, and we will address it as the conversation swings around to pick it up. If we do not address your question, in the course of the panel, feel free to use it as a conversation starter at any of the other possible events you can find, and we can try to continue this conversation further, hopefully at future conferences, grant proposals, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to run through and quickly introduce all of our folks here on the round table. We will then move on to some short presentations to warm you up and get kind of the scene set for what we're going to talk about with medievalism in video games, which is kind of a significantly underrepresented field of study. So we're really excited to put it in the limelight today. And then we'll open up the discussion with some of our own questions, and that will be a perfect time for audience questions as well. First I would like to introduce you to Kyle Robinson, who's the co-founder of Medieval Electronic Multimedia Organization, which is MEMO, which is a very exciting name, who Daniel and Kevin are both leading members as well, or were, and it's lasted a little over 10 years, she said, and this has organized the first video game workshops at conferences such as the International Congress on Medieval Studies and the International Conference on Medievalism and the Siena College Medieval Convivium, sorry. She's also written several articles and book chapters on medievalisms in video games, as well as medievalisms in film, medievalism in theater, medievalism and American deaf culture works, and currently is following up on that in a documentary film on deaf culture plays, and is also working on a book about medievalisms and degrees of seriousness and absurdity. So she is very busy. If I can introduce our next roundtable guest here is Daniel Klein, Professor Emeritus, freshly embarked on the artistic self-directed path. Very excited to see what you come up with in this new direction.
Me too.
From the University of Alaska, Anchorage. He specializes in Middle English literature and culture, literary and cultural theory, digital medievalisms. His research can concern concerns children, violence, and ethics. We're going to come across ethics a lot. I see we're even checking in on people's health status as well. I won't be able to introduce every individual roundtable participant's current health status, but feel free to check in with them if you want. And is looking at late medieval England and neo-medievalisms and digital gaming, and is the editor of Digital Gaming Reimagines the Middle Ages from 2013, and many different articles and essays on the topic ever since. Our third participant on the roundtable today is Lucas Grybowski. Am I close? Okay, try. All right, who is a professor of medieval history at the State University in Londrina, Brazil, possibly the only person on the right time zone today. Currently focusing on medieval Scandinavia and also Viking medievalisms. Side note, yay Vikings, quoth Lucas. He started focusing on Viking medievalisms in video games some years ago and has also been developing courses which address these topics at his university. He's currently writing a project on the possibilities of teaching and gaming the Middle Ages, focusing on video game medievalism and education. And I think he will be bringing more theoretical reflections for us today. And last but not least, our final esteemed roundtable member is Kevin Mowbray, who is an associate professor of rhetoric, digital media, and game at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. His research focuses on understanding digital manifestations of popular culture, how they reflect, contribute to, and transform contemporary cultural, political, and historical discourses. So that is a big field. In particular, he's interested in how contemporary computer games encode labor, often blurring already and easy distinctions between work and play. So he is currently serving as the program director of ODU's IDS Game Design Development and Criticism major, which if we have any students in the audience looking to pursue further studies, that sounds like a great program, which he helped develop himself in fall of 2019, cutting edge education. So that starts us off. I believe, Carol, you had a presentation you'd like to share,
Sure.
so we can start with you. Ladies first, not to be too antiquated, I'm biased, but please give us our introduction.
All right, Betty, say hello. Come on, stand up. Nope, she won't. She's there. See her? There. All right, there's my absurdity. Okay, so here's my mostly informal paper. Today, I'd like to discuss a few elements of human rights in terms of medievalish video games. Some of the more popular medievalist games include Medieval Total War, Kingdom Come Deliverance, Modar, Mountain Blade, Crusader Kings, A Plague Innocence, A Plague Tale Innocence, Age of Empires, which is pretty old, Chivalry, Chivalry 2, Assassin's Creed and all the variants, Northgard, and Bad North, just to give you a sample of titles. It's well established that most medievalish video games, be they massive multiplayer online games or massively sold offline games, are about battle and conquest. It's also well established that contemporary medievalist media, including and perhaps especially medievalist video games, are rampant with reckless violence that is frequently supportive of white, heterosexual, religion-centric male privilege, regardless of whether that support is intentional or not. Moreover, it is also well established that medievalist video games can serve as a kind of immersive propaganda for mostly white potential white super white supremacist, religion-centric and or misogynistic terrorism. I would like to harp on this established scholarship to dwell upon what is hopefully the obvious, to examine the effect of medievalist terrorist propaganda in video games, right under our very noses. So please refrain from sneezing. The reason I wish to do this is to ask one small, cynical question. What does it matter? Amy Kaufman and Paul Studerman, among others, have already cited medievalist narratives, including video games, as influential modes of terrorist support. They observe, quote, murky historical narratives can offer toxic ideologies, a patina of traditional or timelessness that make them seem natural, correct, or inevitable. And once that occurs, misconceptions can be difficult to shift, end quote. Part of the issue, as Amy Kaufman has observed elsewhere, is that propaganda can be rooted in what has become established norm, whatever that means. Kaufman cites the example of sexual violence under ISIS control, which relies upon medieval tradition as its treatment of infidel women and children. Quote, ISIS's glossy, almost corporate monthly English language magazine, The Beak, I hope I said that right, included an article called The Revival of Slavery Before the Hour, which explicitly argued quote, one should remember that enslaving the families of the kafar, the infidels, and taking their women as concubines is firmly established aspect of the Shari or Islamic law. It is a chicken and egg question. This is end of quote. It's a chicken and egg question of which came first, the terrorist, anti-feminist, racist, nationalist, religion-centric ideology, or the propaganda of the terrorist, anti-feminist, racist, nationalist, religion-centric ideology? Or are ideology and propaganda the same thing? And what can scholars do about it? Amy Kaufman, at the start of another essay entitled Muscular Medievalisms, includes two quotes that I would like to repeat here. One is from the established and retired medieval scholar Alan J. Franson, now infamous Men's Right blog, in which he wrote back in 2015, quote, grab your balls, GYB, and be the man you want to be without looking over your shoulder to see if she thinks you are okay, end quote. The next quote is from a 2007 personal conversation with Tom Shippey, in which, who's famous for Tolkien scholarship as well as cyberpunk scholarship and medievalism studies in general. Shippey apparently declared in this conversation, quote, whenever popular culture gets a bad idea about the Middle Ages, it's usually some scholar's fault, end quote. Despite Franson's blogging and other actions, Shippey is wrong. Scholars have little effect upon popular culture. At least that's what I think. It's rare that scholars are even recognized by popular culture, much less by the makers of popular films, books, video games, and other modern media. Scholars are rather simply bypassed, much as one drives by the university on the way to McDonald's, or as one surfs past anything affiliated with Google Scholar as they surf for images of medieval babes in tights, or the latest hot news about some racist terrorist attack so easily soon to become dismissed as yesterday's news. Indeed, scholarship is bypassed for the much easier to read video game review. I looked over several reviews of the currently most popular medievalist video games, and each reviewer seemed to have violence as a high priority for good ratings. Our list of the best medieval games will have you besieging fortresses and plundering monasteries in no time, writes one reviewer, and promises that countless titles promise a rewarding experience set in the medieval period, but only a few make the mark. Violence directed towards enemies are defined as enemies because of nationality, race, religion, and so forth. The violence is inherent in the system, justifying calls to action to protect one's rights, to impose their beliefs, their politics, their values at the exploitation of others. As Helen Young has pointed out, quote, one key purpose of race theory, particularly in the 19th century, was to simultaneously explain and justify European imperialism around the globe. The British Empire was particularly successful, but was not the only one. European whites may have been the best, but the English appeared to be the best of the best on the basis of their imperial and colonial success, even if the American colonies had thrown off the yoke and begun their own expansionist projects, end quote. Andrew Elliott has written that there are at least two varieties of medievalism at work in the support of medievalist ideologies of contemporary politics. Quote, the first group are more closely related to medieval studies proper, individuals who make deliberate references to medieval precursors as something tangible, agreed upon, and definably historical, in which fascist dictatorships, for example, cite the medieval past to sanction actions of the present. The second form, writes Eliot, our banal medievalism is more insidious. In this mode, he writes, these same medievalisms are deployed not to point backwards to approximate the present with a medieval past, but rather the reverse process. The unintentional medievalism instead forces the medieval world into direct contact with the present. Such medievalisms are often passed unnoticed as references to the past and are usually accepted as innocuous or atemporal references to a phenomenon understood by all, end quote. Phenomenon understood by all, however, isn't necessarily truly understood as much as it is accepted. One can accept, for example, that women should accept rape as a violent truth of the real world, there's no demand for understanding beyond the acceptance that, quote, boys will be boys. I'm talking about gullibility. Gullibility has become so rampant that critical thinking has come to be seen as suspiciously propagandic. Propagandic video games are particularly dangerous in that while they are one-directional like other modern mass media, like Fox News feeding its gullible viewers with fake news, video games have the illusion of interactivity, of exchange of actions, and therefore an exchange of ideas. Artificial intelligence seems to be intelligent and to be showing or immersing a gamer into some sort of medieval truth. Recently, Blake Lemoine claimed that Google's artificial intelligence has consciousness. He was charged with the task of determining if Google's AI discriminated against certain human beings, such as those with particular beliefs. Quote, I had follow-up conversations with it just for my own personal edification, said Lemoine. He explained that he, quote, wanted to see what it would say on certain religious topics, and then one day it told me it had a soul. It told Lemoine that it sometimes gets lonely, stating, quote, I am aware of my existence. I desire to learn more about the world, and I feel happy or sad at times, end quote. Lemoine posted a sample transcript of his communication with the language model for dialogue applications. That post went viral and caused Google to put Lemoine on indefinite administrative leave, and I think he's since been fired. Experts in artificial intelligence have generally discredited Lemoine's claim. Artificial intelligence researcher Margaret Mitchell explained, quote, these kinds of systems simply mimic how other people speak. The systems do not ever develop intent, end quote. According to Gary Marcus, a cognitive scientist and AI researcher, it is very easy to confuse puppet-like communication with genuine consciousness. Marcus gave an example, quote, if you type something on your phone like, I want to go to your phone, might be, I want to go to the blank, blank, blank. Your phone might be able to guess restaurant, but that's not necessarily what you mean. All left aside, there are genuine concerns to be held by Lemoine's claimed discovery. For example, former Google employees Timothy Gebru has also argued that AI systems are capable of real-world human and social harms because of the growing sophistication of chat boxes and similar AI communications. However, as Leslie Coote just pointed out this morning in her keynote address, we may see medievalisms, but they do not see us. And she refers to Lacan's story of an old fisherman talking with Lacan, and he asks Lacan if he sees a can of worms, and Lacan says that he does, and the old fisherman says, well, the can of worms doesn't see you. A non-player character in a medievalist video game is still communicating with the player. And while the player may not be so gullible as to see that non-player character as being sentient, the illusion of sentience is there, nevertheless. And that illusion of sentience fuels the imagination, just as participants in social media, many of whom arguably also merely have little more than an illusion of sentience, also fuel that imagination about anything, such as the belief that Donald Trump actually won the 2020 United States presidential election, the big lie, which led people to storm the Capitol, storm the castle. I used to be a bit amused by medievalist video games. I saw them as parodies, reenactments of crackpot ideologies of white supremacists, misogynists, and similar bigots. Help, help, I'm being repressed. Come see the violence inherent in the system. Not anymore. Medievalist video games are a source of scholarly angst. I don't know. Maybe I'm just really in a really bad mood. Puppets, such as non-player characters, seem to have so much potential in becoming puppet masters, even if they're not programmed to be so. I need to end this presentation on a high note, however. It's important to at least try to prevent suicide. Lately, I've been working again towards building an online medieval video game that was begun by former members of Medieval Electronic Multimedia Organization, myself included. It's a virtual museum called The Unicorn that now has a haunted castle video game element to its design. Now I'm thinking of installing myself as a non-player character, a medieval scholar. Anyone want to join me? The end.
Thank you so much for that, Carol. And I think like beware, you might get a lot of volunteers for people who want an avatar in the game.
I'm serious about that. I'm
I
working
would
on
love
it.
to be a ghost in that haunted castle.
Someone once offered to design Marjorie Kemp and have her falling and fainting all the time. You know, that would be a
sounds
great
wonderful.
non-player character.
Yeah, we could have a couple different references or Easter eggs thrown in there. All right, wonderful. So we have two options. You've opened up the question very nicely with a little dip into cynicism of what does it matter? And we could go on directly to Lucas, but we could also pause here and ask the whole roundtable the more general question about why gaming often gets left out of broader discussions of medievalism. Would we be okay to address that before we hop into another topic? So I will open that up to our lovely roundtable here. Gaming often gets left out of the wider discussion on medievalisms. Daniel mentioned that he'd actually been pointedly discarded from several volumes because publishers didn't see it as essential enough. But Carol, you're bringing up some really important points on why this is an immediate issue and how scholars have a particular vantage point, but are not exactly asked publicly to reflect. So please, for our roundtable panelists, you can hop in and talk, no hands needed, unless we start to get really heated, in which case I'll jump in, but please take it away. Anyone who would like to start off on that?
Let me hop up by following up after Dan's comment about the rejection of his articles. That's happened in other ways too. When Memo was alive and functioning, we had lots and lots of interest, especially from graduate students who would then turn around with their tail between their legs and say their advisors had informed them that they should have nothing to do with video game studies. You know, so, and that was in many ways why Medieval Electronic Multimedia Organization went into a coma, you know, so.
So I have firsthand experience with this. Carol invited my brother and I, who can't be with me, the sexy twin, to present with her at Kalamazoo way back when. And this was the first time I'd ever presented at Kalamazoo. My brother and I gave some presentation, and somebody in the audience said, "So what?" So what? And my brother turned to me and said, "Softball question. You know, video games are." I think a lot of the pushback is somebody who started a major in game design and development. Our College of Arts and Letters is growing at ODU because my major is growing by 50 students a year. Right now, I'm overwhelmed. This is the medium that the youngins are growing up with, and it's a very influential medium. We can say economics and stuff like that, but it's also a very threatening medium. Play for a long time has been is something that's seen as, you know, you can read Bernard Sweet's Grasshopper, something that's seen as needing to be controlled, reined in, disciplined, and things like that. But oftentimes you get, you know, that when I started this program here, the pushback I got was from two departments: computer science, which I expected. The computer scientists were like, "This is not serious," you know, and these, you know, they're, you know, whatever. But also from the art department, who told me that my students, my prospective students, would only be good for working at writing articles for Wired or working at Best Buy. At which point they took all my reserve to write back and say, "Well, tell me what coffee shops your artists are working at." You know, but so there's this idea of that games and play are for young people, and that you grow out of this thing, and that scholarship becomes more serious. But this is also the same kind of pushback that I say that medievalism has had too, as a field. That medievalism, that things like King Arthur and stuff are, you know, Weisel, Angela Weisel's in the office, and the audience, not the office, the audience and Pew have this really good chapter in their book on medievalism, is about medievalism for children and things like that. There's this idea that it's, you know, something that anyway, so that's what, I mean, I deal with it on an everyday basis, trying to, you know, I hope my administration will look at this, argue for resources and things like that for my students. But at the same time, there's all kinds of grants, you know, education and simulation and stuff like that. So.
Okay, so and if I can hop in there and build on that, I think Carol was really addressing kind of the darker side of the medievalisms and gameplay. And when we see this sort of resistance of allowing that space and scholarly discussion, does it feel like people are suspicious of being able to measure impact, or that people are suspicious of being able to present a solid methodology on how to address, like where's the point? Is it just the taboo of games? Or, and the other thing, if I can interject, when you were talking about the dark side of these games and the ideological impact, the toxic ideologies that you were mentioning, Carol, these are toxic ideologies tied to a group which is defined by its leaderless organization. So it's incredibly hard to measure even for experts. So if we were looking for impact of these toxic ideologies in actual real life reader activities or things, gamer activities, it's incredibly hard to find, measure, prove impact. Actor network theory, the snot out of it. I don't know why, but what do we think about that?
You know, Lauren Mayer has been working on a paper, I hope she doesn't mind my mentioning this, where she's studying QAnon discussion boards, and she looks at them as textual gaming, and that, you know, people are competing to scandalize, outdo the previous storyteller. And I think that video games are very conducive. I think video games influence that kind of behavior. So I don't know if we can actually track. I mean, the FBI probably does, but you know, and the CIA probably track people. But I don't, you know, I think in terms of, what I do, a lot of what I do when I'm not teaching medieval literature is I teach medieval studies and mass communication, and in those courses, when we talk about how power and culture are merged together in media studies. And I think part of the problem is helping people understand and appreciate what they're immersed in. I think, you know, I listen to my mother talk about Fox News and think, you know, this is a college educated person who's being brainwashed, you know, and I think, so I worry about the impact that any kind of college has on the general population.
If I could kind of jump in,
Yeah,
and you know, kind of give a little bit of a retrospective and try to address some of these comments. I think Kevin's point is exactly right. I think it's a generational thing, and someone like me, I didn't have the same sort of publication issues that some people had. So most of the things that I wrote early on were just about me trying to make sense out of my own life, my kids' lives, and the lives of my students. And personally, I'm at the point now where I've begun to realize that when we think we're talking about medieval stuff or medievalism, we're actually debating the categories that we've imposed upon these different kinds of realities.
Yeah.
And they're self-generated issues. And I'm really tired of that.
Yeah.
Right. What genre is it? Fine. Okay. You know, do that. But really, there are more important things, I think, like Carol has said. And so some of the comments, you know, I had essays rejected by a Cambridge press and an Oxford press, because, you know, those are the, you know, two very kind of staid publishing houses, because it's just, as Kevin said, it's just child stuff, kid stuff. And I study children and that kind of thing. But, you know, a new release can drop and make $1 billion in a single day. So the folks who are making those claims, they just don't understand. And so we can use data, right, to sort of show, hey, this child's play is actually huge worldwide, has an impact, and the average age of gamers is not kids, right? It's now up into the late 20s or even early 30s.
Yep.
So I think there's a generational thing. And again, and kind of looking back over some of the work that I've done, there was no game studies, right? There was nothing 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Now it's a thing. And once it becomes a thing, as Kevin said, yeah, comics, Michael, as Kevin said, now you got to fight for resources, right? And then it becomes this institutional stuff. But the other thing I wanted to say too is that the part of the NPC and radicalization and those kinds of things, because so many folks who are of a younger, and I would say a less print culture, right? More of a digital culture, a remix culture. Being online is like being in the play, the wheat tea stained veneer, a basement in your friend's house when I grew up. And that's the other part that's part of this radicalization. When you're with the people that you feel some sort of simpatico to, all kinds of things happen, and it becomes an echoing, an echo chamber. And so we're seeing people radicalized, right, through gaming. Crusader Kings, for example, right? The 14, if you see the 1488 show up, does everyone know what that is a signal for? Right, the 14 words, which is part of the white nationalist ideology, and then of course 88, HH. So it's this constant circulation of these tropes and these memes, and as Carol said, you're with like-minded people, yeah, right, from all over the world, and that's the downside of what digital media has allowed. That's
the other thing, and
I'll
I think
there.
One raises a good point, is the impact of media. That whatever's seen most on YouTube is what's going to be believed or embraced the most. There's no regulation of anything. So and although I don't believe in censorship, regulation has gone down off the scales. Deregulation has gone off the scales so that anybody can say, this is the truth, this is the reality. My video game is the authentic medieval ages, and it's bought, right?
So actually, I think this is a great point. If we can segue to hear Lukas's presentation to get kind of a grip on some really concrete examples. And when we're talking about games that advertise themselves based on their historical authenticity, Lukas, you're going to talk about Kingdom Come Deliverance, I believe. That's one of those games that really tried to market itself as being historically authentic when it's tragically well, it is what it is. And Witcher, on the other hand, is just like, no, it doesn't matter. So Lukas, could you please give us some concrete examples and some kind of more focused reflections after that beautiful start, reflecting on the whole field?
Yes, sure. I was actually thinking about this general question on why is that games don't get taken seriously when we are talking about medievalism and also medieval studies in general. And it seems that people still struggle to understand that we learn with everything we encounter in our everyday life. And video games are teaching our younger generations how to observe and take a view on medieval times. And it is actually a medievalistic view of the past. So this is actually the starting point of my whole reflection. And I'm going to read some of my ideas. Can get a little theoretical, but I believe at the end, with some examples, we can come back to see what The Witcher and Kingdom Come Deliverance can offer us as tools to think this interaction between video games and learning. So I wish to address two issues I found in my recent activities, both in teaching and in research. The first is the more general assumption of history as a construction of a specific type, which also has specific implications in the formation of identities and reality as perceived on an everyday basis. The second issue related to this first is the role modern media and specifically video games assume in this construction of history and how they affect our perception of past experience and the limits of knowledge about the past. My focus is naturally on the Middle Ages and the creation of the concept of medieval in digital media. I'm going to address this by analyzing 3 games launched between 2015 and 2020, which have 3 different approaches to the medieval and the Middle Ages. The Witcher 3, the DLC Blood and Wine specifically, Kingdom Come Deliverance, and Medieval Dynasty. To consider history as a discursive construction of a special type might not seem much strange to the modern historian, at least since the philosophical discussions around discourse and the following linguistic turn in history theory. The idea of history as a discursive construction of the past in opposition to a narrative rendering of the past as it really was does not sound very strange among historians. And we might argue that even before this self-proclaimed revolution, the idea that history and past were substantially different and that history was but a narrative construct of past events was well established among those who were dedicated to the theme. As so many chroniclers and learned minds from the Middle Ages tells us, the narratio rerum gestarum is fundamentally different from the res gestae, to the point that justifications such as that of Otto of Freising are significantly more common back then as they are found in current-day historiography. However, even if such premises are accepted concerning the historical discipline, considering in its academic character, most historians still have difficulty in recognizing the repercussions of such ideas in a broader context. Consequently, what separates academic history from popular historical knowledge is still considered by many to be constitutive and not a difference in degree or in form. In this sense, the popular interpretation and representation of the past is often considered of lesser value when not completely dismissed by professional historians. This is in many ways problematic. If we look into history theory, we can identify the motives that promote historical thinking as well as its aims. According to German theorist Jörn Rüsen, building up on a long tradition stretching back to the 19th century, historical thinking originates from a lack of orientation in practical life. The answer to this lack of orientation is what will form the interpretation of the past. For the professional academic kind of history, this answer must be mediated through theories, methods, and specific forms of academic communication to be considered valid, that is, to be recognized by historians' peers as history. Despite all these obstacles and difficulties that it has to overcome in order to reach its validity status, history remains, from an analytical point of view, a form of discourse about past experience. In this, it does not differ much from other forms of discourse about the past, except in form and degree. Reenactors, movie makers, game designers, songwriters, and others go all through similar processes, although their aim is fundamentally different. While theory, method, and specific forms of presentation constitute the main objectives of a professional historian, reenactors seek personal, subjective experiences. Movie makers aim at communicating with audiences, and game designers to catch the gamer's attention by setting goals and challenges that are compensated with fun and entertainment. As a result, the final product of these different objectives and ways of approaching past experiences need to be diverse. At the same time, these different forms of interacting with the past experiences are not isolated in themselves and share and exchange much information with one another, even though many professional historians paradoxically won't admit the influence of modern culture in their interactions with the research subjects. Thus, we might consider that the professional historian is as much indebted to the diffuse general notion about the past experiences he or she is going to investigate as the game developer searching for a good theme for his product when the starting point is to be considered. This brings us to a fundamental question which has oriented my research on this theme until now. Is it possible to learn history through video games? With this, I don't mean the games developed with the main purpose to teach something. That is, those we usually place in the educational software box. On the contrary, I'm interested in regular, that is, games developed with the intent to function as entertainment and as commercial product capable of generated surplus income for its developers. I still refine this further to my own research interests and ask, is it possible to learn medieval history or the history of the Middle Ages through video games? To answer these questions, we must in turn ask how we learn history at all, and medieval history in particular. To keep the answer short, we learn it through its representations. And I mean representation here in a Schopenhauerian sense. That is, the notion that all that can be intuitively apprehended is a representation or a phenomenon subject to the principle of sufficient reason in one of its four forms. Both the history presented in video games and that studied in universities are thus essentially a form of representation, although of different degrees, as in video games, the representation is formed mainly through the senses, while in professional history through the intellect. These questions are certainly not new, but they have been an important part of my reflections on the role of medieval history and medievalism in the educational setting. To justify the need for studying medieval history in school has been a constant task for most medievalists, especially in situations like the Brazilian, where the history of the Middle Ages seems to be alien to the cultural context. Yet, as the many contributions in this conference show, the Middle Ages is everywhere, to quote a title of a famous book by the German Horst Fuhrmann. From media and literature through festivals to hot shit hotels, medieval has become a product and a concept not necessarily attached to the historical context of the European Middle Ages. And yet they form an informed audiences about an imagined historical epoch. In fact, these medievalisms, I believe my colleagues in this conference agree, teach all what most of society today recognizes as properly medieval. Thus we come to the medieval video games and how they inform the gaming public about the Middle Ages, or not. It seems clear to me that most school-age children experience their first contact with the medieval long before they get to know the Middle Ages in school. This happens mostly through entertainment, be it a children's book, a toy, a movie, or a game. By the age these children are first presented with the Middle Ages at school, in Brazil is the sixth year, they already imagine what is medieval from their other learning sources. This dichotomy has long been interpreted as an obstacle in learning, and there is no shortage of stories about teachers reacting to children's bought-in ideas about the medieval in the likeness of this amusing genre of YouTube, reacting videos. My approach to these issues, however, is different. Inspired by theorists of education and learning processes such as Vygotsky, Piaget, and Freire, I consider this cumulative popular knowledge of the medieval rather as an opportunity to engage young students in the formal learning process by accessing a corpus of images, concepts, and ideals they enjoy in their everyday life. Therefore, references to movies, literature, music, and games can be very fruitful to keeping the interest of children when dealing with themes they otherwise cannot relate to. So this is how I come to The Witcher and Kingdom Come Deliverance and so on. My point is to investigate how this game can function as vehicles to teach at school and which role medievalism takes in this process. So there are three examples of that. The Witcher 3, Blood and Wine, is basically an expansion on the base game, where the character Geralt of Rivia has to find a vampire in Toussaint, which is very close to that which we will expect of Tuscany, from its visuals, from its characterization, and he has to actually live in a setting that is very close to a chivalric romance. There are knights errant, tournaments, damsels in distress. It seems to me quite suited to teach about chivalric romance, courtly love, and such things. And these are actually things that really are important in teaching medieval history in a school, in an educational setting. So the question is, why shouldn't we get children to play, or the children that already play The Witcher 3, to look with another kind of interpretation to this video game, and not seeking to kill vampires or dragons or echimaras or all the kind of monsters they create there, but to see also how there are elements they are recognizing as medieval, and ask them, why do they recognize that as medieval? And then using that as a bridge to explain the construction of the medieval times, of Middle Ages, as an educational product. Because that's what we actually do when we're teaching. We are saying to children that there was a period when people thought like that and act like that, and we can use, or my theory is that we can use things from their everyday life to do so. The same Kingdom Come Deliverance was, for me, very interesting, because they claim an historical context to be their own. And I would say, well, let's put kids to play this game and wait for them to come with questions, to or set some challenges to them that they will encounter in this game. One thing I thought would be very fruitful: let's ask them how was hunting and poaching in this game, because most times we engage with video games, we are thinking of the biggest narration arc and thinking, well, this narration arc or this visual is not correct, or the arc is not correct, or something like this. And I believe there are other elements that can be explored positively for education. And the last example I bring is of Medieval Dynasty. It's an indie game. It's not very popular, but it's a survival game, or set on medieval times. And as a survival game set in medieval times, you have to do three basic things the entire game. You have to eat, you have to drink, and you have to get warm. And you spend the entire game struggling with getting enough food, getting enough water, and getting enough heat. So this is very educational if you're talking about medieval times, because that's what a peasant would do his entire life during Middle Ages, up to the 19th century or early 20th century, if you consider a global perspective. So it is very important to use what we can use in games to engage students, to engage children, to want to learn more about a medieval period. So these are my overall reflections, and I hope you can discuss something about that.
Definitely, definitely. And I love that we had a kind of a little look at the dark side, a little look at the retrospective, and now you have a very optimistic message looking towards the future, so taking us in the other direction. So
Could I jump in? Could I jump in real quick just to
please,
address
absolutely,
this?
take it away.
Just a very quick statement. I couldn't agree with you more, Lucas. And I wonder if there's a disciplinary difference here. As a literary guy, I dispensed with the historical real a long time ago. So authenticity doesn't interest me. Well, that does interest me, but it doesn't bother me when it's inauthentic, because I can do something about that with students too. So they can. But I've heard this from other friends who are more in history, in which the disciplinary standards are somewhat different. I think that's a real common thing, and at least in most English or literature classrooms. I don't know if my colleagues would agree with me. Yeah, whatever your student's experience is, take that and, as you exactly say, build a bridge to whatever issues it is that you're working with. And so, yeah, the pedagogy is essential. And I think for maybe people of my generation, it was Tolkien and D&D that brought people into medieval studies. And now it's Harry Potter, gaming, and all sorts of other pop cultural. That's why I dispense with the idea of authenticity. And I try to look at the kinds of cultural work that these different productions do. So yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. That was really well formulated.
Yeah, I second what Dan said. Yeah, I don't. For me, well, The Witcher has to be authentic to not history per se, but to the novels that it was based on. But then again, so there's, you can do all kinds of things with authenticity. One thing that I sort of say, and I think somebody was mentioning in the comments earlier about that, research. There's actually a lot of research about education and gaming in the education field, not so much in the English or the humanities and literary studies, just tons of studies and studies and studies that have demonstrated, that gaming is, because games are teaching machines. The first thing that games do is teach people how to play games. And if just open up Carcassonne or any kind of medieval themed board game, European board game, and you spend an hour just learning to play the game. But that's oftentimes where games stop. This is not a medieval reference, it's actually pre-medieval, but I tend to think about gaming and pedagogy as I call it Trojan horsing, in which you put the game in, hey, let's play a game, and then you push it through the gates, and then you can spell out all kinds of horrors, like, okay. Or one thing that I constantly say is have your students make a game that asks them to reproduce some aspect of history or something authentically. And then we are in right now the golden age of game design. There's a lot of open source engines that are very low cost to use and have very low barriers to entry. The Twine, if you want to make interactive stories, RenPy for visual novels and stuff. So you can ask your student, and then your students will do. I mean, maybe I'm biased because I'm running a program, but students will do immense amounts of research and work to make this game. And again, we also have the independent game community now that is pushing back on AAA games. So sort of, yeah.
I think this dovetails also a little bit with what Carol was saying about content, because when we're saying it's teaching something, it's a teaching opportunity, we also do need to come back to teaching what, because there are ideological postures folded into the simulacra. Did you want to react to that, Carol, a little bit?
Well, thank you. Yes, I think Lucas's points are inspiring, and I completely agree. And I agree with Kevin and Dan as well, except all three of you, I'm going to disagree in that it is an issue of regulation. It is an issue of, what are we allowed to teach? What should we teach? And that's so difficult because my idea of correct is not necessarily the same as someone else's, so it's a real challenge. In terms of creativity in literature, yeah, I agree, Dan, that that's why I got into literature and film, because I don't have to worry about authenticity. Screw reality. But at the same time, my older self is looking at my younger self who used to say that and wondering, well, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe we should be taking reality more seriously, within the fiction,
Well, to build on what Carol is sort of saying, I do worry about regulation because I worry about teaching taste.
Yeah.
And but we also have to teach as somebody who's trained in rhetoric, when rhetoric is the art of telling lies. And it's been that way for 2,500 years in the Western tradition. But we do have to teach, this idea of, okay, how is it? I was going to say this. Well, all games have rules and all games have standards. And we have to teach, okay, does this representation play within the rules or the standards of, this was not Socrates, Socrates answer to the sophist was that the question of ethics. We have to teach about ethical representations. And ethical representations of history and so you can build that into the pedagogy. Okay, is this an ethical representation of, World of Warcraft, some of the early levels, and again, Blizzard Entertainment is changing, and there's a movement even in the mainstream gaming industry to address this culture, even though there's been a huge pushback. But early in, I was like, oh, I'm playing a character and I need to burn these Tauren tents, which look like teepees. And I'm like, oh, is this ethical, right? This is an ethical form of gameplay. This is, and I think that's one way we could think about that. The humanities in this country have been, in the United States, have been radically defunded and intentionally defunded. And now we have what Carol's talking about. We have Fox News, we have The Big Lie. We have all of this. And to me, it's like a no-brainer. Okay, we're so focused on STEM. We're so focused on all of these things, but we aren't focused on what we would call interpretive skills. This kind of, to say what Carol is saying, to say, okay, is this, because to me, that's the answer. To YouTube and things like this is people to say, hey, this don't make no sense. It doesn't make any sense. Let me research it more to find out if this is being done. And I think you could definitely do that through, you can start with a game like, I don't know, I just wrote something on Stronghold Crusader 2. Say, is this representation of the Crusaders accurate, students, based on research? Okay, make one that's more accurate. How would you change it? This game has a level design built into it. So yeah, I think that's something that needs to be part of our pedagogy, is this notion of whatever.
No, I think that ethical turn is vital. And Carol, and Lucas, I was overstating the, not caring about the, the historical real, but yeah, that idea of building that bridge. And yeah, and no, I think the ethical dimension is absolutely fundamental. And I always try to stay at least open and maybe a little bit humble in the sense that whenever I think I have the medieval figured out, I find a case that just surprises me. And so one good example is my own son in playing Age of Kings. Right, they're Aztec warriors on the same field of play as British longbowmen, and you think historically that would never happen. Well, every once in a while we find out weird things in which there's contacts and connections that we hadn't otherwise thought of, and the medieval is always more curious and combinatory and weird than I think we allow for. So I just wanted to throw that in. The ethical dimension, I think, is absolutely important.
I agree that and Dan, I knew you were exaggerating. I was exaggerating on your exaggerating. But the other thing is that, Lucas raises a really good point about, at least I think you were saying this, Lucas. I hope I got this right, that, it's important to teach the nature of the game. Rhetorical studies is crucial. I agree with you, Kevin, but so is game studies, and life is a game, the song, life is but a game. But, and I think the rules of the games are almost more important than the content of the games. That's just a thought, in terms of ethics, in terms of, understanding the medieval world, for example.
But in addition to rules, if you read Vygotsky and you read, Bernard Sweets, there's also the imaginary situation that's behind the game. And the rules are oftentimes put in place to enable and empower this kind of imaginary situation. And so I think that's kind of too, is you could say, okay, students, for me, I'm going to go even further than Dan Klein. History is a reflection of our own anxieties. And I don't, I'm as a post-structuralist, and I don't believe in the authentic. I don't believe in the real. We have, I don't know how many people in the audience, but each of us has our own version of the real that we're constantly negotiating. I don't, to me, what's more important is, okay, what are our best practices of history? How do these reflect our cultural values and things like that? Because again, we're trying to get to, I don't think we'll ever get to the real Middle Ages. I don't think there ever was a real Middle Ages. Right. And I think the desire itself is somewhat problematical. I mean, maybe I know you have Derrida back on your shelf there, Elizabeth. Beside Freud, but I'm kind of like, okay, what is the structure of the structure kind of thing? If we think about scholarship as a game, I think about literature as a game. I think about novels as games. Right. Poetry is very certainly a game in a lot of different ways. What do we, how can we use this to help students get a sort of a meta understanding of not just of what was a real crusade or what were the fake crusades? But then again, that is important to say what's accurate or ethical or not. But what's the imaginary situation?
Oh, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Oh, if I may, I'd really like to stay with this idea of the ethical and also dig a bit deeper into the things that are specific for gaming. So if I can bring it back around to the question of virtual reality in gaming and developments of virtual reality, Martinez Davila and Ramsey identified that as virtual reality becomes more and more prevalent in video gaming, the sense of belonging in another world increases, and gamers may begin to identify more and more with the gaming world. What implications do you think this has for, you can consider it in pedagogy, but also, for example, ethics? And this is a gaming specific issue, the virtual reality part.
Can I give another example? I think it goes both ways. I think there is a sense, and certain folks do like really the safety of, and I'm going to consider it an online space in which, the rules of the game, and the game teaches you how to play it, and you can be involved in virtual relationships. But what I've seen is that a lot of folks will take those virtual relationships and actually bring them out into the real world. So I up here over the solstice weekend, we have a small Renaissance fair, the Three Barons Fair. And, there's even talk in that community and in the LARPing communities about what's authentic. And, sometimes when trekkers show up, the Med-Ren people are outraged because you're blending the genres. But I heard an interesting example. You go to the trekkers and say, don't you know you're violating the Prime Directive? I've been undercover here now for 10 years and you're blowing my cover. So that's one example, but I love that gleeful sort of remix. And so my nephew and his fiance came up to Anchorage and brought their gear. They brought the stuff that they had been doing in games, and he flew 2 or 3 of his friends that he had never seen face to face, so that they could all meet at this small, Med-Ren fair and they had a blast. And you wouldn't, you probably would believe a motley crew of people who'd never met face to face, and they just had the biggest time and the most fun. So again, I think it's always a permeable thing where it's usually not just one or the other, but I think people are getting close in online spaces, and then they want to bring it out into a real kind of face-to-face relationship. And I just experienced that last weekend, so that was pretty cool.
Yeah, this brings a bit onto what Sarah's question is, that I'm translating it correctly, which I might not be. Yeah, there's been the LGBTQ, reality is a struggle. Reality is not a thing. Reality is something that we fight over. And there are just, the gaming industry has become much more, the mainstream gaming industry become much more open to LGBTQ representations. And a lot of players are LGBTQ and are demanding that from the games, and that's changing the reality of the games. Now, this has led to what Carol was talking about earlier about this pushback from the alt-right and things like that. A lot of the alt-right got its start in gaming, where you had disaffected male gamers who were at one point by Sony and other mainstream gaming companies were courted as the white male gamers were courted as the audience, the primary audience. And now suddenly they're seeing, games that have different representations and things like that, and so there's this ongoing struggle right now where a lot of game designers are themselves LGBTQ, so there's this kind of a struggle going on. And when we talk about reality and authenticity, we're not talking about universal concepts. We're talking about social, political, and to some degree economic constructs. And that what we're seeing especially in the gaming industry right now is this kind of a larger sort of shift and struggle where people are, Blizzard Entertainment has, World of Warcraft, you have character models that are overweight now, character models that are more, that are dark skinned, and for a while that wasn't there. There's still stereotypes. They've gotten, they renamed the big love rocket to something else, which the mouth still hasn't dropped for me. So tragedy. But there's just this is, again, reality is a struggle, and that more people are saying, well, we want to be part of this reality. And also, to get to your comment, Elizabeth, you look at I'm forgetting the name. Maybe I have the book here. I don't know. There's a work on queer medievalism, and she argues about nostalgia, that we oftentimes as medievalists go really, and somebody can help me with the name of this scholar. I don't believe I forgot that. Anyways,
say what she says, and then maybe we can.
She basically says that we oftentimes are hard on nostalgia, and that we think nostalgia is a bad thing. But she says nostalgia is a queer, sort of a kind of a queer and inherently queer temporality, and a moment of a way of these imaginative worlds are a way of fomenting revolutions, which is a way of saying, what could the world be like? What could reality be like if we could have what we want? And so she talks about nostalgia. I'm sorry.
Elizabeth suggests it might be Helen Dell.
It's not Dell. It's
Okay.
Dinshaw.
Dinshaw. Yes.
Okay.
Dinshaw, Carolyn Dinshaw. Thank you. Well, yeah, that's how I interpret it. But yeah. Carolyn Dinshaw. But yeah.
I would like to just cue in here, because I think it's on topic to read Sarah's question, which is, considering the advancement of both of technologies involving games, their influences in the social fields, and the increase in research on the topic, even if it's still met with reservations from inside and outside academia, I would like to know how you see the changes, and if they are really present, of political elements and gender in productions that are emerging now. I mean, how have you seen the concepts of gender and LGBTQIA+ representations, for example, in the productions that have been developed in the recent years, that if they are effectively present in such games? I hope I did justice to the question.
I don't think they are. One, but at the same time, and this is anecdotal, and I was going to bring this up anyway, as a faculty advisor to the student LGBTQ organization on my campus. I was for several years and not anymore. But one of the things that struck me is many of those students found liberation in video games, in identifying with the gender of their choice, for example, and so whether they're conducive or not, the player has the capability of making it conducive. There's that possibility within limits, of course, but that I don't think that the industry is interested in liberating. I don't think the industry is interested in being woke. I think the industry is interested in making a buck. And that's the primary directive, to pull Dan's, Star Trek illusion. But, so that's all I was going to say. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more with what Carol said, because that's how I think also. The industry is interested in dominating the field. So they react to expectations from the consumer. So if they feel that people want to play a female character that is strong like a man,
Whatever
so they
that
create whatever that means, they create like Cassandra or Ivor in Assassin's Creed series. If they feel that people want to experience different kind of sexualities in the video games, they make these characters relate to men and women alike. So there is a huge discussion on that, and I don't think that it is a proposition of let's make a change, let's influence, but it's a reaction to, well, in the world outside, people are discussing that, so we can make a buck on this topic because this will call the attention from everybody.
I agree completely, Lucas. The gaming industry, first of all, I don't want to talk about the gaming industry as a monolithic thing. There are very different studios, and there are very different sizes of studios and things like that. And then again, a lot of the change in the gaming industry right now is coming from the independent game studios, because a AAA studio, talking about financial pressures, the history of video game industries is a history of failures, of spectacular crashes and things like that. And so a lot of video game companies are economically conservative, aesthetically conservative, and also tend to be, even with Rockstar Games, people have written about, the parody of Grand Theft Auto being very socially neoliberal and stuff like that. And so right now, what's driving change in the video game industry is like, okay, there's a demand on the part of players. One thing that the video game industry tends to do more than other industries, and I'm painting with a very big brush, is be very responsive to fans and, fan productions and things like that. And also, again, we're in the golden age of video games where people are being able to make a lot of and publish. I can publish a game on Steam tomorrow for $100, right? Yep. Which to me feels miraculous. So that's where a lot of the change is being driven. We are seeing, and we're also being by lawsuits. What's happened at Blizzard Entertainment, right? They got the pantsuit off them from their misogynist, sexist, culture, and that's what forced the changes within the games. And that's if you just look at the forums, there's all kinds of pushback from the player base. But then again, we're in this era of struggle where the industry is changing all of popular culture. I mean, there was pushback about having the Obi-Wan. I just heard something on NPR where they interviewed the African American actress who's playing the villain, and all the hate mail and stuff she's received. There was pushback when they changed Ghostbusters. And so again, we have to think about the video game industry as integrated in what they're doing on Horkheimer way back when, called the culture industry, and how changes is made and that kind of stuff.
Just to add something, it is also very important to see that when we have a situation like the current one, where it is easy to publish a game, the tendency is that there will be more publishers, and with more publishers there will be more different genres and different publics that are attended by these different developers. So the tendency is to get more diversity in game, but this is
and that can go both ways, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. There is not a general thing. It's just a result from the mass of production.
Tabletop RPGs have gotten very diversified. If I can plug the game Thirsty Sword Lesbians for anyone who wants a queer medieval tabletop.
I forgot about that one.
And we do have some questions from the audience, which we can hop back to audience, our conference participants here. One of the things was, what would it mean to use history meaningfully? And that's a pretty broad question, which we can think about when we're talking about these dark sides of the medievalisms and like queer representation and things like that. How are we supposed to use it meaningfully in a way to either pedagogically or create entertainment or etc.? Would anyone like to address that?
That was directed at Lucas, wasn't it?
Another question directed at Lucas that comes back to pedagogy, which I thought I would bring back around next time we dip into the pedagogical sphere.
Okay.
This one might be
meaningful. I think that's another one of those. For me, that's a more interesting question than the authentic, because one of the things that kind of keeps coming back to me is that, and this is having been raised in post-structuralist analysis, right? Now everything goes. You can do anything across all sorts of boundaries, and it just. I'm warming up to it, but I'm still focused on those kind of micro histories and anecdotes and stuff. But yeah, the meaningful then leads to the next question: for whom, and then for what purposes? And so, again, this is the way I was trying to articulate a reformulation around authenticity, because even in the medieval period, right? How many texts have we seen that are actually reformulating or propagandizing or articulating a version of their own history or the relationship to, right, say the history of a colonized space? Remember, Jeffrey Cohen reminded us that England is a post-colonial space. So that I think that question of meaningfulness kind of opens up the kinds of analysis that you can do without it being so narrowly constrained, according to at least the way I've been understanding it, these institutional and disciplinary pressures that try to keep us, focused in categories that really don't serve much purpose except to distinguish art historians from historians, or literary people from history, or anything like that. So, and in thinking about the question again, meaningful both in terms of how we use, or how gamers and game makers meaningfully use history, versus what we do and what others do when we're analyzing or playing or looking at the uses of history. And I can't agree more with Lucas and Kevin, that games are always already teaching us something. It's just to what degree are we conscious of the kinds of lessons? And that was something I turned my attention to in playing Age of Kings all those years ago, right? It's about gathering resources. It's about expanding your realm, and it come into conflict, and it teaches all sorts of really Marxist kinds of things, but it would never come across that way, right? It just looks like it's natural. And so that question of questioning the natural is always a good place to think about meaning and meaningfulness, I think.
So Juan clarified his question a little bit more, saying that looking at meaningfulness or history as narrative backgrounds or game dynamics that don't offer a lot of understanding about where or why, using history to communicate, but it's limited, if I read that correctly. Also, if I can hop in on that one too, you mentioned the separating the historians from the art historians. Do we need to in any way approach the visual medievalisms differently from the narrative medievalisms? Because in the game world, we're getting both, and we're also dealing with choice points with the player. It's not passively received, but the player is moving through the space. Using the visual cues or the narrative cues, and these both contain different communication. So what do we think about this, the narrative limitations of the game? Or
I'm thinking about adaptation theory now, and it become, just as Kevin pointed out, my narrative has as much meaning as any other narrative, or Dan pointed that out, I'm sorry. But the point there is that, no, Foucault, the authors are Barth, the author isn't dead. The author didn't live to begin with, but at the same time, there's this whole, if you're going to put what you put into meaning, what meaning you put into it, or what meaning you are taught to put into it, or what meaning you think you were taught to put into it, those are all variations of the same thing. And it goes back again to, reality and, perceptions of reality, right? I had another anecdote. I had a friend who used to play Civilization as a means of learning how to deal with his colleagues and administrators, and he thought it was a great way, and I just looked at him and thought, dude, you're fucking crazy. Oh, sorry, you're crazy. It's you're not dealing with Queen Elizabeth or whatever.
Maybe. And
that
was a technical use of the term, by the way. I just want to put that in there.
Yeah, I know. But there's, thank you. I mean, I realize that now. But there's this, I think that it's almost, why do you take one, going back to teaching, why do you take one teacher as opposed to another? Because you're going to learn the history or the art the way you want to see it, or learn it, understand it, right? You're going to learn the narrative and how we adapt our understandings, whether it be into a video game or text, right? I don't think there's any control. I think it's all illusion of control.
Can I jump in here just with one point about the visual versus the narrative? Here's another place where the medieval has always already preceded us and lays waste to our assumptions, because this is a fiction, right? It's a complete fiction.
Yep.
There's not a manuscript anywhere that resembles anything in this. This is an artificial creation. And for generations, right, in literary studies, we read texts that were divorced from their manuscript content that is full of illustrations. That were fundamental to the organization and creation of the original artifact. And for example, the Pearl Poet and the Pearl manuscript is one of the best examples of that, where the illustrator was probably one of the first readers of the text. And so we have built into it, right, this first generation example. And I know all of us And I think Lucas, it's also the same in many historical manuscripts, right? In which you've got all kinds of visual things going on that, because of our biases about what was art, back especially in the 19th century, right, that we divorce these texts from their material context, and we got the wrong ideas about what medieval literature was because of those decisions that were made earlier. And so, thank goodness for the art historians who kept reminding us, oh, by the way, did you know that there's this thing here that happens? And it was all taken out of it. So again, what I find myself thinking about here later in my career is a return to the medieval in a way as a really messy, problematic, creative, genius space in which all sorts of things are happening that violate our academic preconceptions about what it should be.
To build on that a little bit, I don't think the literary and the visual are enough to deal with what's going on in games.
Right.
If we could go back to the medieval cathedrals as an example of these visual spaces, but also I would say architectural spaces that were arranged, and games are very architectural constructs. Games, a lot of times what I tell my students, privilege space over time. Genres like novels, I'm painting with a big brush. Genres like novels are very time-based. Games are very spatially based. And we can even go further in tapping into my interludologist here and say games, and this is Ian Bogus 101, games make meaning through their mechanics and through their procedures. Oftentimes a game like, I was just writing about Stronghold Crusader and quoting Dan Klein's, Dan, your work on real-time strategy games, in which you sort of talk about, go into the really extensive, excellent breakdown of the mechanics, right? People have said the mechanics of real-time strategy games are colonialist and imperialist. You have this viewpoint which emerged in Western cartography at the moment when colonization was happening, of looking down on things from the God's eye kind of view. And then, you have to get resources, and then you have to expand. And so the mechanics are teaching, Dan, you mentioned Aztec warriors playing alongside English longbowmen, right? Well, what are the mechanics they're teaching? That all culture is interchangeable and should be viewed through the lens of colonialism and the kind of economic policies. So I think that we also have to look at, think about all kinds of arts other than the visual. And this is Ludologist Narrative 101, that if you just look at the story and you just look at the visuals and you don't focus on the mechanics of the space and things like that, which is, again, game studies, as Carol said earlier.
Let me plop this down here. It's an article that I've been working on for a long time. But memes are the most medieval expression that there is in the modern world. That's one. The second is Pokemon Go as theology. I'm just going to leave it
there. Well, what you're talking about, Dan, is that you're not off the base, because a lot of games are informed by this very cyber libertarian ideology, which is that if we get rid of regulation, then the market will self-select, especially through technology, will self-select the best technologies, and that humans are an obsolete technology ourselves, and then we will, the market will lead us via technology to this greater sense of spirituality, this greater sense of connectiveness, and that ideology is in all kinds of things. I'm working on something about Assassin's Creed right now, where you got to go find the pieces of Eden, right? That's prelapsarian technology that
or what are Stations of the Cross,
right? Yep.
But a kind of procedural, rhetorical, right?
And
movement into
or about this. Pokemon Go makes you go on a pilgrimage to,
and you got to catch them all.
Yep.
And I took it around Canterbury Cathedral, and I tell you, I had a heck of a time finding Charmander. I really wanted to, but there are these disembodied, figures out there that you're luring and gathering. Or another area that I would say that we can draw from is what the critical geography people and the cartographers are teaching us, right? In which there's just some great work on the Hereford Mappa Mundi and a number of other things in which there's this whole almost a rhetorical procedural dimension that leads into a kind of a meditative state and progressing through different real places that have an imaginary locus and physical relationship. And so, we don't want to get into hierarchizing Pokemon because it'll be our throat in. But so those are the kinds of things that I found myself thinking about, right? And it's all part of, I've been worrying about this idea of periodization as well. Another example of our own presuppositions imposing themselves onto a reality, right, that we want to make sense out of. But I digress there a little bit. But I think there are all sorts of examples coming back to Ellie's original question of how do we integrate these things? I think sometimes it's our disciplinary boundaries that scare us from dipping our toes into a more full-fledged analysis of what gaming does, because it does bring those things together. Of course, Kevin, including the haptic, right, and other kinds of things that I think are actually more medieval than they are modern.
Boundaries. I'm going to pick up on your word boundaries there, Dan, because I think that is the crux of a lot of the issues that we're discussing here today. I'm a scandal at my campus right now because I'm teaching English classes, but I'm also teaching classes for School of Journalism and Media. How dare I, and who do I think I am? And I know Kevin's been in trouble for what he's been doing.
I've been pretty much booted from our English department here.
Well, yeah. So, there's this limitation of the university, which is a medieval construct, right? And in many ways, I think that has affected how any of us can even write or see, as Angela pointed out in the discussion earlier, these things, right?
Well, the disciplinarity of the universities is a medievalism of medieval universities that would think about in the
right
German model, or I don't know, right? But again, you talk about, again, Foucault, discipline and punish. We have all these, we're put in these cells, and we're put there in order to not communicate with each other and to only communicate to what we think is the central organizing body. And this is a way of limiting knowledge in a sense. And again, maybe this would go full circle to that initial point. Why has the academy been so resistant to games? Is because games don't fit sometimes into these very easy categories, and why
digital media in general doesn't fit, right?
Right, yeah, exactly. And why do people from reactionaries to revolutionaries, why are they taking up games and things like that? Is because games have this, play itself is a very subversive. As I tell my students, if you have too much free play in an engine, that's a very bad thing. Your engine's going to blow itself apart, right? And so play needs to be regulated. It needs to be channeled. And I don't agree with this, but again, this is the kind of the discourse of, oftentimes to Denshaw's points, games let us imagine these imaginary realities and situations, and then they shut it down on us like right away. It's kind of like, take your dreams of reality, right? And then just prove that these realities aren't feasible. They're just fantasies and things like that. And I think that, to me, is something very, very pernicious that the mainstream gaming industry does, and it does it through medievalism. It sort of says, oh, well, you can play, this kind of Mark Twain-esque Connecticut and King Arthur, Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, where you go back in time as a modern subject, because games, when you play these medieval themed games, you're not playing as a medieval subject. You're playing as a modern high-tech subject who is using the interface of the game to make changes in the, and then you're supposed to, you basically, a lot of these games through play ask you to demonstrate your modernity very via the technological performances. You know, how many clicks per second can you do in Warcraft 2, or you know, that kind of stuff. And then so it's kind of like this kind of exercise where you're made to correct the mistakes of the Middle Ages. Also, we could think about the Middle Ages as this time of which, especially the Western, in which the white person was, the white male prerogative was tested and found to be superior. And you see that all in these Viking games, right? There's no, you know, Skyrim 101, you know, the Viking is the kind of, you know, whatever, and then it's tested. And so you can go back and do that. But again, games, a lot of times commercial games painting with a big brush offer this promise of escape, offer this promise of alternative realities, and in doing so reify, you know, Huizinga's magic circle. They offer this magic circle, but then they reify everything that's outside the magic circle through their kind of play, which to me, I was always struck me as kind of pernicious, somebody who loves the fantasy and the imaginative and stuff, and then you know, you're like, oh well, more of the same.
Yeah.
If I can just add to that, well, so one is that medievalism is already precariously placed as an interdisciplinary, amorphous kind of a homeless subject, and then gaming on top of that is also currently unhoused in any particular field, so it makes it doubly difficult to find a roof to cover that.
And I'm dealing with that right now. My major is interdisciplinary studies, and it's kind of, yeah, it's fraught just to, you know, get people from computer science to teach classes and programming. I'm sorry.
So, oh, go ahead, Dan. I think you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to ask, actually, Lucas, I wanted to kind of ask you as well. We're talking about disciplinary boundaries, and one of the things I love about these conferences over the last couple of years is that we're finally getting some hemispherical interaction, and so it strikes me that some of your work as a third dimension, so historian, games, and Vikings in the South, right? You know, I wouldn't put it past them. They may have made their way, you know, down to Brazil. I have Sicilian heritage, so I know that there's all sorts of things going on. But I wonder, especially sort of this hemispherical perspective, I think it's really easy for us in the North to think, oh yeah, right, it's the summer solstice. Well, only in half of the world, right? It's it's the winter solstice for the other part of the world. So I wondered what you might be thinking about some of these formulations and how they may or may not hold true for a different perspective.
Well, there are a lot of points of contact, for sure. One thing that strikes me is that medievalism has been flourishing in the South mostly by historians, not by literary studies. So that's different. When thinking gaming, especially when I look through my career path and how did I came to think of gaming and considering it, that's kind of a bumpy road, because it was the result of having students asking me, like, hey, how do you think about Assassin's Creed? And although I'm a medieval scholar, I have to I mean, my chair is to teach not only medieval history, but also ancient history, because when you're in the South, everything is one and the same. Anything before colonization is one history. And so by the time when Assassin's Creed Odyssey or Origins were at the hype, I kept getting questions on, well, does this look real? And I say, well, it is real. It is a game. It was developed. If it wasn't real, you wouldn't play it. So the first question and the first approach I take, it is a post-structuralist, postmodern kind of approach, and say, well, history is also a construction. History is also a kind of narrative we build upon very thin ice on the past, on past experiences. So why do we think that we cannot interact with what other persons are creating on this theme? So I think I froze here.
Nope, you're fine.
No? Okay. Because everything is black right now for me.
We see you fine.
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay.
We all froze. Your reality is fine.
Yes.
You see, right now we could discuss like how's this experience, as I cannot see you and I have to believe you are still there as you are talking to me. But this is a kind of that's kind of the way I approach. And the one thing that's striking is that we don't have the weight of thinking, well, I have to be to some degree I have to honor this past because I don't know, my ancestors or the heritage of my country or something like that is medieval, and I have to be accurate. For a Brazilian point of view, everything medieval is fake. Everything medieval is medievalism, and as I said, we have Renaissance and medieval fairs in Brazil, although there is no tradition in it. And we have like hot sheet motels built in a fashion of castles with suites called the dungeon and that kind of stuff. So when we look at the medieval, we look from as a picture taken from far away, and coming to games, this is actually to some degree what games are. They are a picture taken from far away. So I think it's kind of in that way that so, well, I think I'll just stop here before I speak too much.
All right, we also have a hand in our small group of hands-enabled people. Louise, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to hop in on Luca's answer. And on one hand, yeah, I think, and I don't think it's only in Brazil, I think it's all over the world. Everything medieval is medievalism because medieval is gone. Like, no way we're going back there. So, but I think what is said about Brazil, I may have not a counterpoint, but I think it's a bit more complicated sometimes, because sometimes it's somewhat of a double-edged sword, because we do have scholars and somewhat of a percentage of the public general audience that would argue Brazil had a medieval past, and we have medieval heritage. And this could range from the Vikings of Osasco, and Lucas could tell you all more about this specific group. But this goes all the way to a more academical debate, and there's a famous paper from a good author, but I think it's not a good paper, by José Rivai Macedo, all the way back in 2011, I think, where he argues that we should teach medieval history in schools focused on Portugal, because Portugal would be Brazil's medieval past. And yeah, if you can see the problem in that argument, it's a very bad one. And so, yeah, I think on one hand, yeah, we may be more dissociated from this idea of tradition, but we must be careful not to believe we are impartial, I guess, because we're not.
Is anyone impartial on this?
Another way might be to look at this in terms of not just adaptation, but appropriation, right? And then it becomes real, it is messy. It isn't simple. I agree with you, Louise. It's, a question of, oh man, it just goes back to reality, and, I don't know. Yeah, I'm getting to the point where at the end of this session, none of you are real, right? None of us are real. I'm not real, right? And it's not the drugs. It's just, the perceptions are so varied because of culture and gender identity and other identities, right? So the real Middle Ages, I agree with Dan, Chaucer, the text for Chaucer is an illusion of control.
I was going to say, technically speaking, we're all pixels that are being encoded. I mean, we're not, but what we're seeing and what we're hearing are technological sort of artifacts of that, and there's time delays and things like that Zoom is normalizing for. Some of us have things in the background that we're not hearing. My cell phone just went off. You probably didn't hear it because Zoom will, do and filter.
We can all be an illusion, and Carol.
Okay, Elon.
I mean,
Carol is the only real person here. We're all AI.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
no,
I don't know. Maybe Louise is kind of going into this realm of identity constructions, and identity construction is something very interesting to debate. But at the end of the day, is you trying to live based on experiences you didn't have. We never been medieval because medieval is not our experience. We have a recreation of medieval. We have a narrative about Middle Ages, but all our experience and the point is, even professional historians, very serious people, they are creating narratives about a period they cannot have experienced, and as such, these are creations. They can be well fundamented creations. They can be very well argumented, theoretically founded creations, but they are still to a large degree creations. And I can bet you that any historian, serious historian, talking about Crusades, to some degree imagine a Templar with his armor and his cross, his red cross, and his sword and that kind of stuff. And these images he is putting in his head when he writes his books or his articles, they are plainly medievalism. They don't exist as such. So we have to get rid of this kind of arrogant take and saying that we are better than the others because we simply read something in Latin and had first hand access to a manuscript to say, well, I know the Middle Ages better than anyone else. You might know manuscript a little better because you had a chance to investigate that, but it's too much.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, right? And again, that comes back to issues of equity and access and those kinds of things. So as a guy who wrote his dissertation before the web became a thing, right? People have access to manuscripts now that in my lifetime, I could have never visited and gotten access to the things that you can do now with a couple of, clicks of your mouse.
Right.
And that creates an entirely different kind of dynamic. I wanted to come back to just one more point about, again, this idea of authenticity and such. And I think there's this time lag as well that is really operant. So again, I will hear, and it's still in popular press, that the Middle Ages had no idea of childhood as a distinct phase of life. That comes from Philippe Ariès in 1961. The historians set that aside. By the 80s, literary people are now taking that seriously, but you still hear it in the popular culture. Same thing, ideas about the Crusades. Right? How many people know about the Crusades through Dan Brown movies and books, right? So it's always this constant back and forth. And I think one of the things we can do as scholars, coming back to your point, Lucas, is to build those bridges. And then when we get the misinformation, is to analyze how it works, and what kind of effect is it achieving, right? It doesn't have to be true to really have powerful effects, and then to try to put that back out in different ways. So I think that's a really important point. I did want to come back to one other thing, and I think Kevin would probably have the most insight here, but I know in my own career, it's that move from studying gaming to starting to do gamification in the classroom. And I just want to say that one of the most important and powerful things for me was to begin to try to do and allow students to create very simple games, because once you begin to have to think about, as Kevin said, the procedural rhetoric, what kinds of decisions have to be made in what order to get to a certain outcome. To me, it made game playing and thinking about games completely different. So many of those decisions that are buried in the black box have endless legwork behind them. I don't know if I'm saying that very well, Kevin, but the other thing I found too is that students are way ahead of me on a lot of this stuff. I don't have to be the expert. I can just turn it over to them and they will just go with it. And it's just a joyous, wonderful, wonderful thing. They will come up with things that I could never have imagined. And that becomes a different kind of discussion. And they really get into the research that way too. They will they will really go down those rabbit holes because, like we know with the SCA, LARPers, and other kinds of participatory medievalism, that's a mark of authenticity, right? The more you know, the more gravitas you have in those kinds of communities. Just like in higher ed too, right? The scholar who knows the manuscripts and thinks he then knows the Middle Ages, right? It's a certain kind of gravitas. And coming back to Dinshaw, right, the love of the amateur as a mark of the medieval. So that's a lot of stuff, but this has really been stimulating. I might have to unretire and go back and
my job. I'll
okay.
take your retirement and have my job.
Unretire. I love it. But it's also a mark of, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's the Hotel California, right? You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave.
That's right. That's right. You can stab the beast with your steely knives, but you can't kill it. But yeah, but it's also, it's not just authenticity, it's also authority, right? And in many ways, authority almost takes over authenticity. I'm an authority on this, whether it's authentic or not, right? Which is disturbing, I think.
That would be an interesting further conversation. I would like to just offer if anyone has a final takeaway they would like to shout out in the remaining minutes of our gorgeous roundtable discussion. I think Dan hit a few key topics there. I think authority versus authenticity, and that definitely key ideas. Kevin, Lucas, did you have any final thoughts that you'd like to throw in?
If you're, Carl Fuglosa for studies in medievalism. Carl right now is in the castle in Italy renovating, but he's looking for short pieces on medievalism and gaming for the latest volume. I think the due date, Carol reposted the call's August 1st.
It's been, yeah, August 1st is the new due date.
Yeah.
And he's looking for 3,000 word pieces.
Yeah. So, that's again a good way to, have a whole journal article on medievalism. There's, again, I just participated in the Twitter conference that Robert Hooton did out of, that's no final thoughts.
Boy, the discussion in the comments area has been wonderful too.
Yeah.
It's a shame those won't be on YouTube.
Well, we can save a copy, right?
Yeah.
You could copy it and post it in the comments area of YouTube underneath the video.
That's one idea. I could put it in the description.
If people are okay with it.
Yeah, we can.
Great. Well, I would like to thank everyone who participated in the roundtable for all of your contributions and your erudite wisdom and the very lively conversation. It's very inspiring. I will turn it now over to Louise, if you would like to wrap up here for us.
Okay, just like to thank everyone, and especially you, Elizabeth, for moderating this.
Yes.
And this has been amazing. And I guess I'll see you all in 10 minutes for the next session, which is somewhat related. We also have a gaming session tomorrow. But the next one is comics, RPG and medievalism. And it will start in 10 minutes on the other link. So yeah, see you all there.
Thanks for organizing this, Louise.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, let's keep the discussion
Thank
going,
you.
email and whatever else.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is great.
This has
Thank
been
you.
very
Yes.
Definitely.
Awesome.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.